Hi.
How are you?
Thanks for coming. I'm doing great, thanks. My name is Cathy Carter-Snell. I'm an associate professor at Mount Royal University in the Forensic Studies Department. I also coordinate the Forensic Research Network at Mount Royal University. The purpose of today is to bring a group of professionals together and look at ways that as professionals, as police officers, counselors, nurses, we can prevent secondary victimization. Secondary victimization is sometimes termed the second rape. So somebody's been through a sexual assault and they come into a healthcare institution or talk to a police officer to report the assault, and the way they're treated causes further trauma. People say, well, I don't know what to say. How can they be helpful and reduce the trauma?
One of the things that we know is that the first people that the client tells, the patient tells, that makes a huge difference in their healing. And so no pressure on people, but really the first few people that they tell, that goes a long way in whether they are healing or not. And so if they're getting very supportive messages that it wasn't their fault, that they didn't do anything wrong to make this happen, that it was 100% the fault of the person who chose to do this to them, that they're safe now, that they have someone who's there to be there with them and support them, and to really challenge those myths that people tend to really buy into.
They're supposed to be triaged as a category 2 or 3 and receive fairly prompt care. That's not the experience that many of these women have had that I've spoken to.
The other delay I know is the time. Our physician is a physician who's on call for the 8 hours for everybody who comes. So there isn't a backup, meaning once they get into that exam, they're in that room for whatever time it takes.
So that delays things quite a bit if we leave everything to a physician when he or she's the only physician in a community, understandably. Emergency nurses are very skilled at assessment and documentation, and really that's all you need to do.
The fear of, I'll say something wrong, needs to stop. We just need to treat them as people.
That's it. Like any other trauma that we have.
Something simple like a warm blanket. Here you go. We haven't forgotten you. We know you're here. Is there something? Ask them.
Yeah.
You know, I would ask, somebody who's involved in a motor vehicle collision who maybe isn't injured but is waiting for family. I wouldn't hesitate to go and say, what can I do for you? How can I help you? What can I?
And we need to be the same with them.
And I think there's somehow this fear that we're going to say the wrong thing or put the wrong thing in their mind
this kit takes this huge prominence when in fact, with 70 to 80% of sexual assaults, they know who the guy was or the girl was. We don't need DNA. It's whether it was consensual or not.
I think you've summarized these points really well. This idea of fear and perfectionism in a way that, and a fear of having to follow through with all of the potential legal ramifications that get in the way of professionals and crisis workers doing what they want to do, which is help women in this really dire time. And men as well.
And there's language that we use that makes it worse. Like I've seen, unfortunately, in healthcare, words like alleged sexual assault. We don't say alleged car accident.
The one certainty that would have assured that this person didn't get assaulted that night is if the man or woman chose not to assault her. Right. And that is the only certainty.
Yeah. Some of the messaging we're trying to get through to our members is whatever investigation you're undertaking is to go in with an open mind and suspend your judgment of the situation. Let the investigation take you where it will. Right. Easier said than done, and a lot of people have a hard time suspending their judgment.
There's a number of police stations in the US now that have the motto, start by believing. Because we know that only 2 to 3% of women at most ever lie about it. There's many other easier ways to get back at an ex-boyfriend or ex-girlfriend than pretending you got sexually assaulted.
And that's a common question I would get as a supervisor was, I don't know if, I don't know to believe her or not. She seems believable, but I don't know. And my comment is always, you have to maintain that belief until there's evidence to the contrary to suggest otherwise.
I think it's important to know, like around trauma, that our brains don't process information the same way that they do when we are not under trauma. So if we're not experiencing trauma, we remember, well, I walked to 7-Eleven, I went in, I poured a Slurpee, I paid for it. But with trauma, it might be 7-Eleven, Slurpee. So the story isn't full. It's not a sequential memory, and I think that as professionals, having an understanding of that, because sometimes it's like, oh, there's a lot of gaps in that person's story. And so I think it's natural as humans to think, oh, if there's a lot of gaps, then it must be because they're not being truthful about that, and they're leaving things out because they're not true. But really, it's the way that your brain processes trauma when it happens. And so I think
they're seen as less believable.
Yeah.
That's the same from the police perspective. If they gloss over stuff or don't seem to give detail appropriate to the event, I know a lot of investigators have come back and go, I don't think I believe them.
Yeah, there's lots of holes in her story. Or
It's just a matter
she's
of
not giving
digging
me eye
deeper
contact.
and
And just having an understanding of that as well. We've heard from police, well, I don't know if that person has been victimized because they sure don't present as a victim. They're not crying, they're not screaming, I remember starting at with SART and going to a few cases and being like, well, I'm not getting any typical cases. There's no skin under the fingernails, nobody's crying, nobody's bleeding, nobody's yelling. And my coworker telling me I was watching far too much Law and Order SVU.
and I've actually been asked that question in court, and we found in our data that 60 to 70% of the women that come in the research that I focused on women, but men are much the same in my experience, they will come in and be very calm and cooperative. They might even, God forbid, laugh out in the waiting room with a friend because they're waxing and waning between the reality of what's happened and trying to be normal and alternating back and forth.
I think the whole idea that this makes a patient any different than any other patient you'll ever have needs to stop.
Yes.
They're just a patient. Like your patient
Another
who's having a
trauma
heart
patient,
attack or having abdominal pain or has some vague symptoms that you're trying to get to the bottom of, and treat them with the same interest, respect, feeling that I believe you regardless of whether it's a believable story. And I don't mean that in a judgmental way, but for instance, if a person is explaining some symptoms and how they're all linked, and you know that physiologically and anatomically that can't be, but you still listen, and that's their perception of it.
If you went to court, it would be not to give opinion, but to say, this is what I saw, this is what I did. And it would be up to the physician or an expert that they bring in to give opinion on that. 50% of women will develop PTSD, and their symptoms are more severe, more long-lasting, and more resistant to treatment. So if we can prevent some of that by not blaming and shaming, it's really important.
And I think that we are in a bit, like with doctors, nurses, and with advocates, we're in a bit of a better position in that we don't have to go in neutral. Like the police are always talking to us about that we have to go in neutral. We can't say, yes, we believe you. Yes, we don't believe this person. We get to say that because, like you said, 2 to 3% of people are not telling the truth about this, which means that 97 and 98% are. And so whenever I have a person who comes in, I'm going to err on the side of the 98%, not the 2% looking for what might tell me you're not telling the truth. And I get to do that. And I think that, so as advocates, as nurses, definitely as doctors, I think we have a little bit more of that ability to be able to give those messages.
We've certainly found the role of family and support people. I mean, certainly we're here to talk about professionals and crisis workers, but we really have found in the literature that family and support people play a very big role as well in this issue of post-traumatic stress, depression, suicide, and these mental health impacts. So you've raised a really important point.
Yeah, and I think sometimes as professionals we need to do that work with the family, because you will hear them saying, I remember being on a case where the sister was like, yeah, okay, that's great, everything you're saying, but I have words of advice. And then she went through all of these pieces of advice. And so I think somebody stepping in and saying that is potentially harmful, let's think of a different way.
So we all have a role in educating the family and linking them to positive supports. The one thing I hope that people take away from this discussion is that positive support and belief of patients and provision of compassionate care are far more important than worrying about the evidence collection.
I hope that healthcare workers realize, or healthcare providers, who I believe are doing an amazing job, ultimately realize that there's always something for us to learn.
through training and these type of podcasts, we can tweak or improve little things that the investigators are doing while they're dealing with these patients or victims. I think that'll be of great benefit.
If people who have been victimized by sexual assault are treated with compassion, are believed, are encouraged to be and told that it's not their fault, if the accountability is placed on the perpetrators of this crime, I think that people who experience a sexual assault walk away feeling stronger and walk away feeling more empowered than they do if they're not treated in that way.
We can work together as teams, that this idea of connecting as teams to make some changes in our practices, to provide the kind of services that we truly want, that is possible.